The Kanto region holds within it 151 creatures, each carrying its own quiet detail, its own small story that lingers in the data files and development notes of a world that began decades ago. These are not grand narratives, but small moments of design, choices made in programming rooms, adjustments written into code that most players never noticed. Each Pokémon, from the first starter chosen to the legendary creatures hiding in distant caves, contains something worth knowing, something that speaks to how these digital companions were shaped and reshaped over years of games, updates, and careful attention to detail. Tonight, we drift through all 151 of them, one fact at a time. Before we begin, we are almost at 2,000 subscribes, so if you enjoy the videos, make sure to subscribe for more. Bulbasaur learned a particular move at level 7 through most of its early existence, but that changed briefly. In the first 6 generations, the grass-type move Leech Seed arrived at this exact level, pulling health from opponents with each turn that passed. When Sun and Moon released, something shifted, and Vine Whip took that slot instead, offering immediate damage rather than gradual drain. But this change didn't last long. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon reversed the decision, returning Leech Seed to level 7, restoring what had been there from the beginning. The move felt important enough to bring back, a detail small enough to miss, but significant enough to correct. Ivysaur carries a name that caused unexpected problems. In Pokémon Black and White, the Global Trade Station prevented any Ivysaur bearing its original English name from being traded between players. The game's nickname filter, designed to catch inappropriate language, flagged the name itself as offensive, seeing patterns in the letters that weren't intended by the designers. This overly strict censorship created a strange situation where a Pokémon's official name became unusable in certain contexts, forcing players to either rename their Ivysaur or trade it through different means entirely. Venusaur represents a particular challenge for those who draw Pokémon professionally. Ken Sugimori, the artist responsible for much of the series' iconic artwork, has stated that Venusaur remains his least favorite Pokémon to illustrate. The complexity of its design, with the large flower blooming from its back, the overlapping petals, the way the plant growth integrates with the creature's body, all of this creates technical difficulties that simpler designs avoid. What appears straightforward in sprite form becomes intricate work when rendered in detailed official art. Charmander appeared on currency once, in a place far from Japan. The island nation of Niue, located in the Pacific Ocean, released a commemorative $1 coin featuring the Fire-type starter. This small acknowledgement of Pokémon's global reach placed a creature from a video game onto legal tender, blurring the line between digital media and physical recognition in an unexpected way. The coin itself became a collector's item, valued more for its design than its face value. Charmeleon shares something specific with a Pokémon from a different generation. Both Charmeleon and Quilava, the fire type from Johto, possess identical stat totals and distributions. Their hit points, attack power, defense, special capabilities, and speed all align perfectly. This pattern extends through their evolutionary lines as well, with Charmander matching Cyndaquil and Charizard matching Typhlosion. But for the purposes of understanding each creature individually, this fact belongs primarily to Charmeleon, the first of the two to exist in the games. Charizard lost access to certain moves in more recent games. In Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, the fully evolved Fire and Flying type cannot learn Metal Claw or False Swipe through technical machines, despite its pre-evolution Charmander learning. Metal Claw naturally through level progression, and despite having access to False Swipe via TM in previous generations. These removals seem arbitrary, cutting off options that logically should remain available given the evolutionary line's established capabilities. Squirtle has a complicated origin in one version of the Pokémon story. In the original Pokémon Adventures manga, the character known as Green in English translations, or Blue in Japanese versions, did not receive her Squirtle from Professor Oak through any official means. She stole it, taking the water-type starter without permission and naming it Blasty. This criminal beginning added a layer of moral complexity to the manga's narrative that the games and anime typically avoided, presenting a protagonist who operated outside the expected rules of Pokémon training. Wartortle's ears underwent a change in early promotional materials. The Pokémon's design features distinctive white ears that match its fluffy tail, but early anime artwork depicted it differently. In these promotional images, Wartortle's ears were the same color as its face, creating a design inconsistency that was later corrected. The white ears became standard, emphasizing the creature's aquatic elegance and maintaining visual consistency with its tail design. Blastoise carries a category designation that feels deliberately strange. While Squirtle is called the Tiny Turtle Pokémon, and Wartortle is simply the Turtle Pokémon, Blastoise is categorized as the Shellfish Pokémon. This choice seems odd given that a designation like Giant Turtle would make far more sense for a creature that is clearly an enormous turtle with cannons. The strangeness deepens when you discover that Kabuto and Kabutops, the ancient fossil Pokémon, also share the shellfish category, suggesting some intentional connection between Blastoise and these prehistoric creatures that is never explicitly explained in the games. There exists a panel in the Pokémon Adventures manga showing Blastoise in a particularly memorable moment. The image simply looks amusing, capturing the large turtle Pokémon in a composition that emphasizes its bulk and power in a way that feels slightly exaggerated. It stands as one of those small artistic choices that gives personality to a creature that could easily feel generic. Caterpie holds multiple distinctions in the anime's history. It was the very first Pokémon that Ash caught on his journey, captured early in the series when catching mechanics and training philosophies were still being established for viewers. It was also the first Pokémon shown evolving in the anime, transforming into Metapod in a moment that demonstrated one of the game's core concepts in animated form for the first time. Metapod continued this pattern of firsts. The Cocoon Stage Pokémon became the first to evolve in a Pokémon movie, marking another milestone in how evolution was portrayed across different media. These evolutionary moments helped establish the visual language of transformation that would be repeated countless times throughout the franchise's history. Butterfree existed as a bug type that couldn't use bug type moves for years. Despite its obvious insect nature, Butterfree had no access to any bug type attacks until the third generation of games introduced moves that finally aligned with its typing. Before that, players using Butterfree had to rely on other move types entirely, creating a disconnect between what the Pokémon was and what it could actually do in battle. Weedle appears in early concept art that differs from its final design. Game Freak's website once displayed this alternative version, showing how the poison bug Pokémon might have looked before its design was finalized. These early sketches offer glimpses into the iterative process behind even the simplest Pokémon designs. Weedle also holds a unique limitation. It is the only Pokémon incapable of learning any normal type moves whatsoever. The total number of moves Weedle can learn in the mainline games is just 3: Poison Sting, String Shot, and Bug Bite, all of which align with its typing, but leave it without access to the broad utility that normal type moves typically provide. Kakuna's original sprite in Pokémon Red and Blue showed something that later disappeared. In that first generation image, the cocoon appeared to have arms protruding from its form, possibly representing Beedrill beginning to break free from its protective shell. No subsequent game sprite included these arm-like protrusions. but early concept art for Kakuna does show similar features, suggesting the design was intentionally simplified for consistency across later releases. Beedrill's name underwent a small change in spelling. Originally, the English name was spelled with just one L at the end. This was later corrected to include two, matching standard spelling conventions. The Japanese name for Beedrill translates more directly, simply meaning spear, which captures the Pokemon's aggressive pointed design without the wordplay present in its English name. Pidgey produces the shortest vocalization of any Pokemon. Its cry lasts exactly 0.181 seconds, making it barely a sound at all, more of a brief chirp that registers and disappears almost before a player can fully process it. This extremely short cry makes Pidgey immediately distinctive in a strange way, defined partly by how little audio space it occupies. Pidgeotto appears in Pokédex entries as a fierce defender of its territory, described as pecking viciously at any intruders that enter its domain. However, despite this emphasis on pecking behavior, Pidgeotto cannot actually learn the move peck, creating another disconnect between a Pokemon's described behavior and its available moves. Pidgeotto appears on the teams of both the first and last Kanto gym leaders in specific games. In Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, when you rebattle gym leaders after completing the main story, Faulkner, the first gym leader specializing in flying types, has a Pidgeot as his highest level Pokemon. Blue, who serves as the 8th and final gym leader in the Viridian City Gym, also has a Pidgeot on his team during these rematches, creating asymmetry between the beginning and end of the gym challenge. Rattata's early purple sprite presents coloration that differs from what became standard. In that original image, Rattata appeared more purple than the lighter purple that would become its consistent shade across later games. This kind of color adjustment was common in early Pokemon sprites, as the limitations of the Game Boy's display and the learning curve of sprite creation led to many small visual inconsistencies that were corrected over time. Raticate has a dark fan theory associated with it, one that gained enough traction to warrant official response. The theory suggests that Blue's Raticate dies between certain points in the games, based on the fact that it disappears from his team after an encounter on the SS Anne and is never seen again. The theory points to Blue appearing in Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower, where trainers typically mourn lost Pokemon, as evidence of this death. While game developers have never confirmed this theory, it persists as one of the most well-known dark interpretations of Pokemon game events. Spearow appears in the anime's very first episode, attacking Ash and Pikachu in a moment that establishes the danger wild Pokemon can pose. This aggressive encounter drives Ash and Pikachu toward their bonding moment, making Spearow crucial to the anime's foundational relationship, despite being a relatively minor Pokemon in the broader franchise. Fearow has been used by notable trainers in the anime. Team Rocket's Jessie had a Fearow for a period, though it appeared far less frequently than her more iconic partners. The large bird Pokemon served as transportation and battle support before eventually being written out of the show's regular rotation. Akins has a name that works as a simple reversal. Spelled backwards, Akins becomes Snake, making it one of several Pokemon whose English names are straightforward wordplay. This naming convention extends to its evolution as well, creating a pair of Pokemon whose names immediately communicate their basic nature through reversal alone. Arbok continues the reversed naming pattern established by its pre-evolution. Cobra, a variation on the word cobra, spelled backwards, gives Arbok, maintaining the simple wordplay through evolution. The Pokemon's appearance, with its intimidating hood patterns, reinforces this cobra inspiration visually. Pikachu gained its role as the franchise mascot through surprising circumstances. Originally, the the developers considered making Clefairy the primary representative of Pokémon, given its prominent role in early manga. However, Pikachu's popularity in early marketing and its appeal across demographics led to it becoming the face of the entire franchise, a decision that shaped Pokémon's identity for decades. Raichu has received less attention than its pre-evolution throughout the franchise's history. While Pikachu appears constantly across games, anime, movies, and merchandise, Raichu remains relatively uncommon, often treated as optional evolution that many players and the anime itself avoid. Ash's Pikachu famously never evolves, keeping the mascot character in its most recognizable form permanently. Sandshrew is a ground type that curls into a ball for protection, but this defensive behavior connects it to a biological reality. The Pokemon's design draws inspiration from pangolins, real animals that share this curling defense mechanism. The spiky back, the rolling ability, and the digging behavior all reflect characteristics of these endangered mammals, bringing a piece of real-world nature into Pokemon's fantasy ecosystem. Sandslash appears in regional variant form in later generations, gaining ice and steel typing in its Alolan version. However, the original ground-type Sandslash remains distinct, with its large claws and arid habitat preferences, establishing it as a creature adapted to dry, sandy environments, rather than the frozen mountains its regional variant inhabits. Nidoran female and Nidoran male are treated as separate species, despite being sexual dimorphs of the same creature. This unique classification makes them the only Pokémon to be distinguished primarily by biological sex, rather than by form or regional variation. The decision to separate them into two Pokédex entries, rather than one, reflects early game design choices that later Pokémon would handle differently, with gender differences becoming visual variations rather than separate species designations. Nidorina cannot breed despite being an evolved Pokémon, a restriction it shares with its final evolution. This unusual limitation means that Nidorina and Nidoqueen are among the only evolved Pokémon that become unable to produce eggs, requiring players to breed Nidoran female instead if they want offspring. The in-game justification for this remains unclear, creating a biological peculiarity unique to this evolutionary line. Nidoqueen also cannot breed, continuing the restriction from Nidorina. The poison and ground type's inability to produce eggs, despite being fully evolved, creates strategic considerations for players who want to breed for specific traits or moves, forcing them to keep a Nidoran female in their collection rather than relying on their strongest form for breeding purposes. Nidoran male shares the same species separation as its female counterpart, treated as a distinct species rather than a gender variant. This parallel treatment emphasizes the early game design philosophy of making gender differences as prominent as possible, though this approach would be largely abandoned in later generations. Nidorino has appeared in memorable moments across Pokémon media. In the game's opening sequence, a Nidorino battles a Gengar, establishing the competitive nature of Pokémon battles before players even begin their journey. This iconic image has been recreated and referenced throughout the franchise's history, making Nidorino symbolically important despite not being particularly powerful or popular as a Pokémon choice. Nidoking has Poison Point as one of its possible abilities, reflecting the venomous nature suggested by its design. The large horn, aggressive stance, and toxic typing all emphasize its role as a dangerous physical fighter, capable of both direct combat and poison-based status effects that wear opponents down over time. Clefairy almost became the franchise mascot instead of Pikachu. Early materials and the Pokémon manga featured Clefairy prominently, and its cute design seemed perfect for broad appeal. However, Pikachu's electric typing, Simpler design and strong performance in early marketing led to the decision to make it the franchise's primary representative, instead relegating Clefairy to a still prominent but secondary role. Clefable is a fairy type in more recent games, but it was originally classified as normal type. The introduction of the fairy type in Generation 6 retroactively changed Clefable's typing, giving it new resistances and weaknesses that altered how the Pokémon functioned in battle. This type reassignment reflected a broader effort to balance the game's type chart and give fairy types enough representation to function as a legitimate competitive option. Vulpix learns moves at different rates depending on which game you're playing. In some versions, certain fire-type moves come earlier or later in its level progression, affecting how quickly the Pokémon becomes useful in battle. These variations across games reflect ongoing balance adjustments that Game Freak makes to keep Pokémon feeling appropriately powered for their intended role in the regional ecosystem. Ninetales has long been associated with mysticism and curses in its Pokédex entries. The Pokémon is said to live for 1,000 years, to possess supernatural intelligence, and to place curses on those who mistreat it. These dark, folklore-inspired descriptions give Ninetales a gravitas that transcends its status as a relatively common fire type, positioning it as something ancient and dangerous despite being accessible to players fairly early in their journey through Kanto. Jigglypuff appears frequently in the anime as a recurring character with a specific gimmick. This particular Jigglypuff becomes frustrated when it's singing, which puts all listeners to sleep, prevents it from completing its performances. In retaliation, it draws on the faces of those who fall asleep, creating a running joke that continues across many episodes. This comedic portrayal made Jigglypuff memorable to anime viewers, despite being a relatively minor Pokémon in the games themselves. Wigglytuff has the highest hit point-based stat of any normal-type Pokémon from the original 151. This massive health pool makes it surprisingly durable despite its cute appearance, allowing it to absorb damage that would knock out frailer Pokémon several times over. Combined with access to decent support moves, Wigglytuff's survivability makes it more viable in extended battles than its adorable design might suggest. Zubat appears in caves constantly throughout the games, becoming infamous for its frequent, random encounters. Players exploring dark caves without repels face waves of Zubat battles, interrupting progress and draining resources through sheer attrition. This overabundance made Zubat one of the most recognized Pokémon, despite rarely being chosen for teams, known more for being an obstacle than a companion. Golbat has an unusual sprite in some early games, where its mouth appears disproportionately large. This exaggerated design emphasizes its vampiric nature and its tendency to drain opponents, but later sprites would reduce the mouth size slightly to create a more balanced appearance. The evolution from Zubat to Golbat involves this mouth growing significantly, reflecting the Pokémon's increased capacity to drain blood or energy from its victims. Oddish can only be caught during the night in certain games, reflecting its nature as a nocturnal creature that buries itself during the day. This time-based availability adds a layer of strategy to completing the Pokédex, requiring players to adjust their playing schedule or change their system clock to encounter Pokémon like Oddish that only appear during specific time windows. Gloom has one of the most unpleasant Pokédex descriptions in the original games. Its flower constantly drips with a foul-smelling nectar that can be detected from over a mile away. Despite this disgusting characteristic, Gloom remains a necessary step in obtaining either Vileplume or Blossom, forcing players to tolerate its presence despite its deeply unappealing nature. Vileplume has the largest petals of any Pokémon, with its Pokédex entries emphasizing how these massive, toxic petals release clouds of poisonous pollen. The petals are so heavy that Vileplume has difficulty moving quickly, creating a trade-off between its powerful poison-based attacks and its limited mobility. This design reinforces the idea that evolution sometimes brings drawbacks alongside improvements. Paras carries mushrooms on its back that eventually take control of its body. The Pokédex entries for Paras and its evolution describe how these parasitic fungi slowly dominate the host creature, creating a disturbing relationship where the Pokémon becomes a vehicle for the mushroom's survival rather than an independent organism. This dark biological horror is presented matter-of-factly in a game series otherwise focused on friendship and adventure. Parasect represents the end result of the parasitic relationship that begins with Paras. By the time Paras evolves, the mushroom has completely taken over, with Pokédex entries explicitly stating that the mushroom controls Parasect's body and that the original bug Pokémon inside is essentially dead. The large mushroom on Parasect's back has fully consumed its host, turning what was once a living creature into a puppet controlled by fungal intelligence. This makes Parasect one of the darkest Pokémon concepts in the entire series, presenting evolution not as growth, but as consumption and death. Venonat has large compound eyes that dominate its design, giving it an appearance that emphasizes its insect nature despite its somewhat fuzzy, moth-like body. The eyes suggest excellent vision, possibly adapted for nocturnal hunting, though the games never explicitly explore how Venonat uses its enhanced sight, beyond mentioning it in passing. Venomoth continues the large eye design of its pre-evolution while adding wings that release toxic scales. The Pokédex describes these scales as capable of poisoning anything they touch, making Venomoth dangerous even in passive encounters. The moth Pokémon's coloring, primarily purple with darker accents, reinforces its toxic nature visually, warning potential predators of the danger it poses. Diglett exists almost entirely underground, with only its head visible above the surface. What the rest of Diglett's body looks like remains one of Pokémon's enduring mysteries, with various games and media offering contradictory or deliberately vague suggestions. Some sources imply a small body, others hint at something more substantial, and official materials generally avoid committing to a definitive answer, preserving the mystery as part of Diglett's charm. Dugtrio consists of 3 Diglett grouped together, but whether they are 3 separate Pokémon or a single organism with 3 heads remains intentionally ambiguous. The games treat Dugtrio as one Pokémon with one consciousness, but the visual design suggests 3 distinct individuals. This ambiguity mirrors real-world biological questions about colonial organisms and where individuality ends and collective existence begins. Meowth has a prominent role in the anime as part of Team Rocket, unusual for being a Pokémon that can speak human language fluently. This particular Meowth learned to walk upright and speak in an effort to impress a female Meowth, sacrificing its ability to learn the move Payday in the process. This character-specific limitation doesn't affect other Meowth, but it adds depth to the anime's portrayal of Pokémon as individuals capable of choosing their own paths. Persian represents wealth and luxury in its design and Pokédex descriptions. The sleek, cat-like Pokémon is often associated with rich trainers, particularly Giovanni, who uses Persian as his signature Pokémon. This connection between Persian and affluence reinforces themes of power and status that run through the game's narrative, positioning certain Pokémon as symbols of their trainer's social standing. Psyduck appears confused at all times due to constant headaches caused by its psychic powers. This permanent state of distraction makes Psyduck appear incompetent in the anime, where Misty's Psyduck frequently fails to follow commands or understand battle situations. However, it's when its headache becomes severe enough, Psyduck's psychic abilities activate involuntarily, often turning the tide of battles through sheer unconscious power. Golduck's design features a red gem on its forehead that many players assume is related to its psychic abilities. However, Golduck loses the psychic typing that seems implied by this design element and by Psyduck's established psychic powers, remaining purely water type. This missing psychic typing has led to years of speculation about whether it was intended and removed during development, or simply implied but never planned. Mankey is constantly angry, according to all of its Pokédex entries, exhibiting rage as its default emotional state. This permanent fury makes Mankey dangerous to approach and difficult to train, but it also explains the fighting type's aggressive battle style and high attack power. The anger becomes a defining trait that shapes every aspect of how Mankey is portrayed across games and media. Primeape's anger intensifies when it evolves from Mankey, reaching levels that the Pokédex describes as potentially fatal. Certain entries state that Primeape can become so enraged that it dies from the stress of its own fury, a darkly comic exaggeration that nevertheless emphasizes how central anger is to the Pokémon's existence. This rage makes Primeape powerful, but also positions it as a cautionary example of emotion taken to destructive extremes. Growlithe appears as a police Pokémon in various games and anime episodes, used by Officer Jenny across multiple regions. The fire type's loyalty and acute sense of smell make it ideal for law enforcement work, tracking criminals and protecting officers during dangerous situations. This role gives Growlithe a civic duty aspect that few other Pokémon possess, positioning it as a working animal integrated into human society. Arcanine is categorized as a legendary Pokémon in its species classification, despite not being legendary in the gameplay sense. This confusing designation has led to decades of speculation about whether Arcanine was originally intended to be legendary, alongside the bird trio, and later changed to be a regular Pokémon, or whether the legendary label simply refers to its status in ancient lore rather than its rarity in the games. Poliwag's spiral pattern can spiral in either direction, and depending on the individual Pokémon, a detail mentioned in some Pokédex entries. This variation suggests genetic diversity within the species, though the games never actually show Poliwag with different spiral directions in their sprites or models. The mentioned variation exists in lore, but not in visual representation, remaining a piece of biological detail that never manifested in gameplay. Poliwhirl can evolve in two different directions depending on the method used. Using a water stone produces Poliwrath, a fighting and water type focused on physical combat. Trading while holding a King's Rock produces Politoed, a pure water type with a completely different design and battle role. This branching evolution path was one of the first examples of Pokémon having multiple potential final forms, expanding evolutionary possibilities beyond the simple linear progressions that dominated the original games. Poliwrath has a swimming ability that Pokédex entries describe as Olympic level, capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean without stopping. This incredible endurance makes Poliwrath one of the strongest swimmers in the Pokémon world, turning what could be a purely combat-focused Pokémon into a creature with impressive non-battle capabilities as well. Abra sleeps for 18 hours every day, teleporting away from danger reflexively, even while unconscious. This constant sleeping makes Abra notoriously difficult to catch in the games, as it will teleport away from battle before players can weaken it or throw a Pokéball. The only reliable strategy involves moving faster than Abra can react, or using moves that prevent escape, turning the capture into a puzzle rather than a standard battle encounter. Kadabra has been the subject of legal controversy. Uri Geller, a magician and self-proclaimed psychic, sued Nintendo over Kadabra's design, claiming it was an unauthorized parody of himself. He He pointed to the spoons Kadabra holds, the star patterns on its body, and the similarity between Kadabra's Japanese name and his own name as evidence. This lawsuit resulted in Kadabra being effectively removed from the trading card game for years, with no new Kadabra cards printed during the legal dispute. Alakazam has an IQ that Pokédex entries describe as exceeding 5,000, making it one of the most intelligent entities in the Pokémon world. This incredible intellect supposedly gives Alakazam the ability to remember everything that has ever happened to it and to outthink any opponent. The twin spoons it holds amplify its psychic powers, though why spoons specifically are never explained beyond visual reference to spoon-bending psychic demonstrations. Machop's muscles never get sore no matter how much it exercises, according to its Pokédex entries. This biological advantage allows Machop to train constantly without rest, explaining how it develops such powerful fighting abilities despite being one of the smaller fighting-type Pokémon. The lack of muscle soreness suggests a completely different physiology from real-world organisms, one that doesn't produce the same fatigue chemicals or require the same recovery periods. Machoke must wear a belt that restrains its power, preventing it from accidentally injuring others or itself. The Pokédex explains that without this power limiter belt, Machoke's strength would be uncontrollable, posing a danger to everything around it. This detail raises questions about who makes these belts and how they're fitted to wild Machoke, suggesting either human intervention in wild Pokémon populations or some natural equivalent that the Pokédex simplifies for reader comprehension. Machamp has 4 arms that allow it to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, capable of throwing 500 punches in a single second, according to Pokédex claims. This incredible attack speed makes Machamp one of the most physically overwhelming Pokémon in close combat, able to strike faster than opponents can possibly defend. The 4 arms also allow Machamp to perform tasks that would require multiple people, making it valuable for construction and heavy labor beyond its battle capabilities. Bellsprout has a stem-like body that allows it to bend and flex to avoid attacks, using its root feet to anchor itself while its upper body sways. This defensive flexibility makes Bellsprout harder to hit than its frail appearance suggests, though its low defensive stats mean any successful attack will cause significant damage. The design reflects real plant characteristics, translating botanical features into combat abilities. Weepinbell hangs from tree branches by its stem, dangling like a real plant while it waits for prey to pass beneath. When something approaches, Weepinbell sprays poison powder or acid, attempting to dissolve prey for consumption. This carnivorous behavior positions Weepinbell as a predator, despite being a plant, reversing the usual relationship between flora and fauna. Victreebel can swallow whole prey items as large as itself, with its pitcher-like body serving as both a trap and a digestive chamber. The Pokédex describes Victreebel using sweet scents to lure prey close before snapping shut on them, dissolving them with powerful acids over several hours. This horror movie creature design exists within a children's game series, normalized by the cartoonish appearance and the general acceptance of Pokémon as diverse and sometimes dangerous. Tentacool appears in ocean waters so frequently that fishermen consider them pests. In some games, surfing across water routes results in constant Tentacool encounters, interrupting travel and making ocean navigation tedious. This overabundance mirrors Zubit's cave presence, establishing water routes as spaces that require rappels to traverse efficiently rather than environments to explore freely. Tentacruel has 80 tentacles according to Pokédex counts, though sprites and models never show anywhere near this many. The tentacles extend and contract, allowing Tentacruel to catch prey from surprising distances or entangle multiple opponents simultaneously. The poison it injects through these tentacles is described as weak individually, but overwhelming when multiple tentacles strike the same target repeatedly. Geodude has arms but no legs, floating in the air through some unexplained mechanism despite being a rock type. This contradiction between being made of stone and being able to levitate is never addressed in the games, simply accepted as part of Geodude's nature. The arms are used for climbing and grabbing, but how Geodude propels itself through the air remains one of Pokemon's many casual physics violations. Graveler rolls down mountains to move quickly, building momentum until it's moving faster than most Pokemon can react to. This rolling creates a danger for anyone on mountain paths, as a rolling Graveler will crush anything in its path without slowing down. The Pokédex notes that Graveler sometimes rolls over things it didn't mean to, suggesting limited steering ability once it builds sufficient speed. Golem has a shell so hard that dynamite can't crack it, according to Pokédex hyperbole. This incredible durability makes Golem almost immune to physical attacks, though special attacks targeting its lower special defense stat remain effective. The design emphasizes defensive capability over speed or agility, positioning Golem as an immovable obstacle that opponents must either bypass or slowly wear down. Ponyta's flames don't burn people it trusts, a magical property that allows trainers to ride it safely, despite the fire covering its mane and tail. This selective burning suggests intelligence in the flames themselves, or at minimum, a psychic connection between Ponyta and its rider that suppresses the fire's harmful effects. Newly born Ponyta can barely stand, but they strengthen quickly and can keep pace with adult Pokemon within hours. Rapidash can run at speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest land Pokemon. At full gallop, Rapidash's mane and tail burn with increased intensity, creating a visual effect that emphasizes its speed. The Pokédex claims Rapidash can outrun a bullet train, though whether this means maximum speed or sustained speed remains unclear, as most Pokemon with extreme speed claims lack specific context for their measurements. Slowpoke has a tail that is described as delicious, with certain regions considering it a culinary delicacy. This disturbing detail appears in multiple Pokédex entries, establishing that people eat parts of Slowpoke without apparent moral concern. The tail regenerates after being removed, supposedly without causing Slowpoke pain due to its slow nervous system, though this casual mention of harvesting Pokemon body parts for food creates uncomfortable implications about how humans interact with Pokemon beyond battling. Slowbro forms when a Shelder clamps onto a Slowpoke's tail during evolution. The Shelder injects toxins that make Slowpoke stand upright and become smarter, fundamentally changing the host Pokemon's capabilities. This symbiotic or parasitic relationship, depending on interpretation, creates a new entity that is neither fully Slowpoke nor Shelder, but a fusion of both, raising questions about where Slowpoke ends and Slowbro begins as a distinct being. Magnemite and its evolutions are the only Pokemon in the original 151 that have two types without dual typing from the beginning. Originally pure electric type, Magnemite gained steel typing retroactively when the steel type was introduced in Generation 2. This change affected how the evolutionary line functioned in battle, giving it new resistances and weaknesses that altered its strategic role significantly. Magneton consists of 3 Magnemite fused together, combining their magnetic fields to create a more powerful electromagnetic effect. The fusion process, and whether the 3 Magnemite retain individual consciousness or merge into a single mind, is never explained. The design simply presents 3 Magnemite bodies, joined by magnetic force, as the natural evolution, accepted without deep examination of what consciousness means for compound Pokemon. Farfetch'd holds a leek as its weapon and food source, and losing this leek leaves it helpless. The Pokédex notes that Farfetch'd will fight fiercely to defend its leek, as the plant is essential to both survival and self-defense. This dependence on a tool makes Farfetch'd unusual among Pokémon, most of whom rely on inherent biological features rather than found objects for combat effectiveness. Doduo has two heads that share one body, and both heads must sleep simultaneously or the Pokémon cannot rest properly. This biological constraint suggests a shared nervous system despite having two distinct brains, creating a creature that must coordinate between its heads for basic functions. The heads occasionally bicker, according to some Pokédex entries, but they cannot simply separate and go their own ways, bound together by their shared biology. Dodrio adds a third head when Doduo evolves, though how this happens biologically remains unexplained. Each head represents a different emotional state, one for joy, one for sorrow, and one for anger, though how these emotional specializations develop or function is never detailed. The three heads allow Dodrio to watch multiple directions simultaneously, making it difficult to ambush and giving it constant situational awareness. Seal has a horn on its forehead that it uses to break ice, allowing it to create breathing holes in frozen surfaces. This adaptation makes Seal well suited to polar environments where water surfaces freeze completely, trapping aquatic Pokémon beneath the ice. The horn serves both as a tool for survival and as a weapon in battle, demonstrating how Pokémon design often gives creatures features that serve multiple purposes. Dugong can swim in freezing waters at 8 knots, unaffected by temperatures that would immobilize most creatures. The Pokémon's blubber provides insulation that makes Arctic waters feel comfortable, allowing Dugong to live in environments where few other Pokémon can survive. This cold adaptation positions Dugong as an apex predator in frozen regions, facing little competition for resources. Greamer forms from sludge exposed to lunar radiation, according to some Pokédex entries. This origin story, suggesting that pollution can spontaneously become a living creature when exposed to specific energy sources, reflects environmental concerns from the game's development period. Grimer's existence as living toxic waste makes it simultaneously a product of human pollution and a creature that thrives in environments that humans have destroyed. Muck is highly toxic, with Pokédex entries claiming that its body is so poisonous that nothing will grow where it passes for 3 years. This environmental damage makes Muck one of the most ecologically destructive Pokémon, capable of rendering land uninhabitable through simple presence. Despite this danger, trainers can safely interact with Muck, suggesting either exaggeration in the Pokédex or some ability for trainers to neutralize the poison through bonding. Shelder has a simple bivalve design when found in the wild, but the Shelder that clamps onto Slowpoke's tail to create Slowbro looks completely different, with a spiral shell and sharp teeth. This transformation is never explained, leading to speculation that the Shelder changes form during the symbiotic bonding, or that the Shelder attached to Slowbro represents a different developmental stage not seen in wild Shelder populations. Cloyster has the highest defense stat of any Pokémon in the original 151, with a shell so hard that nothing can break it, according to Pokédex claims. This incredible defensive capability makes Cloyster almost impossible to damage with physical attacks, though special attacks can still harm the creature inside the shell. The shell can open briefly to attack, launching spikes or using water-based moves before snapping shut again for protection. Ghastly is composed of poisonous gas, held together by a mysterious force, making it barely material. A strong wind can disperse Ghastly entirely, apparently without killing it, suggesting that the gas can reform as long as the organizing force remains intact. This unusual biology makes Ghastly nearly impossible to hit with physical attacks, as punches and weapons simply pass through the gas without resistance. Haunter can pass through walls as easily as moving through air, making enclosed spaces meaningless for containing it. The ghost type can also lick opponents with its tongue, draining their life force and causing paralysis through sheer terror and energy drain. This combination of intangibility and life-draining attacks makes Haunter dangerous in ways that transcend normal combat, positioning it as a predator that hunts through fear and supernatural ability rather than physical prowess. Gengar hides in shadows and waits for prey to pass by, then emerges to attack. The Pokédex describes Gengar as feeding on the life force of its victims, draining their heat until they freeze to death. This vampiric hunting method makes Gengar one of the most sinister Pokémon conceptually, existing as a predator that specifically targets living creatures for sustenance rather than simply defending territory or competing for resources. Onyx is made of stone and grows longer as it ages, absorbing minerals from the earth as it burrows underground. Despite being 30 feet long in the Pokédex, Onyx weighs only 460 pounds, a weight that makes no sense if it's actually made of solid rock. This impossible mass suggests either that Onyx is hollow or that Pokémon biology follows different physical laws than real-world materials, allowing creatures to have sizes and weights that would be structurally impossible in reality. Drowsy eats dreams, extracting them from sleeping creatures through its trunk-like nose. The Pokédex notes that Drowsy prefers certain types of dreams, finding the dreams of children particularly tasty. This unsettling preference positions Drowsy as a creature that specifically targets young people during their most vulnerable state, though the games never present this as particularly alarming, simply accepting it as part of Drowsy's nature. Hypno has appeared in several dark Pokédex entries and fan theories, most notably one that describes it kidnapping a child. The Pokédex entry states that Hypno once carried off a child it had hypnotized, an incident that was never resolved in the entry itself. This brief mention of child abduction created one of Pokémon's most disturbing canonical moments, suggesting that some Pokémon pose genuine threats to humans beyond battle injuries. Krabby produces foam that hardens into protective bubbles, allowing it to breathe on land for extended periods. This adaptation makes Krabby amphibious in practice, capable of living in both aquatic and terrestrial environments as long as it maintains its foam bubbles. The bubbles also serve as weapons in battle, blinding opponents or creating barriers that absorb attacks. Kingler has one oversized claw that produces 10,000 horsepower of crushing force, according to Pokédex measurements. However, this enormous claw is so heavy that Kingler can barely move it, making the crushing power largely theoretical. The claw makes Kingler unbalanced, forcing it to walk sideways even more than regular crabs do, compensating for the weight distribution that favors one side dramatically. Voltorb appears almost identical to Pokeballs, leading to speculation that it mimics them deliberately or that it somehow evolved to resemble them. The Pokédex offers contradictory explanations, with some entries suggesting Voltorb was discovered shortly after Pokeballs were invented, implying either rapid evolution or that the Pokeball design accidentally matched a pre-existing creature. This ambiguity preserves the mystery of Voltorb's origins while avoiding committing to an explanation that might create logical problems. Electrode is simply an upside-down Voltorb with a different expression, making the evolution one of the simplest visual transformations in the game. This minimal change reflects Electrode's nature as a faster, more explosive version of Voltorb rather than a fundamentally different creature. The speed boost that comes with evolution makes Electrode one of the fastest Pokémon in the original games, often moving first in battle due to its high-speed stat. Exeggcute consists of 6 eggs that work together as a group, with each egg apparently being a seed rather than an actual egg despite the name. The 6 seeds communicate telepathically according to some Pokédex entries, coordinating their movements and deciding when to seek out a leaf stone to trigger evolution. This coordination suggests either 6 separate minds working in harmony or one consciousness distributed across 6 bodies, though the games never clarify which interpretation is correct. Executor has 3 heads when it evolves from Execute, growing into a palm tree-like form. Each head thinks independently, creating a creature with 3 distinct minds that must somehow coordinate to function. The Alolan form of Executor grows extremely tall, becoming the tallest Pokémon in existence and gaining a dragon typing that reflects legends of dragons hiding in tropical trees. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother as a helmet, according to its most famous Pokédex entry. This disturbing origin story establishes every Cubone as an orphan, creating consistent, tragic backstories for an entire species. The logistics of this arrangement, such as how Cubone species continue to reproduce if all mothers die after giving birth, are never addressed, suggesting either that the Pokédex entry is metaphorical or that Cubone reproduction involves complexities the games don't explore. Marowak evolves from Cubone, growing larger and more skilled with the bone it wields as a weapon. The skull helmet remains, now fused to Marowak's head permanently rather than being removable. This permanent bonding with the mother's skull creates a creature whose identity is literally built from death and mourning, making Marowak one of the most symbolically heavy Pokémon designs, despite appearing in a children's game. Hitmonlee has legs that can extend to kick from any distance, stretching like rubber before snapping back into place. This impossible physiology allows Hitmonlee to attack from ranges that should be impossible for a Pokémon of its size, making it unpredictable in combat. The design references Bruce Lee both in name and in fighting style, creating a clear homage that remains one of Pokémon's most obvious pop culture references. Hitmonchan can throw punches faster than the eye can follow, moving its fists so quickly that they become invisible blurs. The Pokémon rests between exchanges, needing to catch its breath after extended combinations, suggesting that even its incredible stamina has limits. The design references Jackie Chan in name, though the fighting style draws more from Western boxing than Chan's martial arts performances. Lickitung has a tongue longer than its entire body, capable of extending several times its own length to reach distant objects or opponents. The tongue is coated in sticky saliva that can paralyze whatever it touches, making every lick potentially debilitating. This exaggerated tongue gives Lickitung a distinctive silhouette and a unique battle style that revolves around its single, most prominent feature. Coughing is filled with toxic gases that it expels through holes in its body. The gases are lighter than air, allowing coughing to float despite having no wings or obvious propulsion method. The Pokédex notes that coughing's body will explode if too much gas builds up without being released, creating a creature that must constantly vent to avoid self-destruction. Wheezing consists of 2 coughing fused together, with both heads sharing the same toxic gas supply. The fusion creates a more efficient poison generator, as the 2 heads can mix different gases to create new combinations more toxic than either could produce alone. This cooperation between fused bodies appears in several Pokémon evolutionary lines, suggesting that fusion is a common evolutionary strategy in the Pokémon world. Rhyhorn has a hide so tough that it doesn't notice when it runs through steel beams or concrete walls. This incredible durability makes Rhyhorn nearly impervious to damage, but it also makes it clumsy, as it can't feel subtle environmental feedback that would help it navigate carefully. The Pokémon charges in straight lines, unable to turn effectively once it builds momentum, creating a combat style based entirely on overwhelming force applied in single directions. Rhydon was the first Pokemon ever designed according to developer interviews, making it the oldest Pokemon conceptually, despite not being number one in the Pokédex. This historical significance gives Rhydon a special place in Pokemon's development history, representing the initial idea that would eventually expand into the entire franchise. The design combines rhinoceros features with dinosaur elements, creating a creature that feels both familiar and fantastical. Chansey has the highest hit point based stat of any non-legendary Pokemon in the original 151, capable of absorbing enormous amounts of damage before fainting. However, its defensive stats are poor, meaning that each individual hit deals significant damage despite the massive health pool. This creates a Pokemon that survives through sheer volume of hit points rather than through damage reduction, making battles against Chansey wars of attrition. Tangela's body is completely hidden beneath vines, with no one knowing what the creature actually looks like underneath. The vines are not attached permanently and fall off regularly, regrowing constantly to maintain the dense covering. This complete concealment makes Tangela mysterious, even after decades of Pokemon games, as official materials consistently refuse to show what's beneath the vines, preserving the mystery as part of the Pokemon's appeal. Kangaskhan is born with a baby already in its pouch, a biological impossibility that the games never attempt to explain. This instant parenthood from birth suggests either that Kangaskhan pregnancy involves two simultaneous offspring at different developmental stages, or that the baby represents something other than a biological child. The mega evolution of Kangaskhan involves the baby growing and participating in battle, temporarily becoming large enough to fight alongside its parent before returning to infant size when the mega evolution ends. Horsea shoots ink to escape from predators, creating clouds of darkness that it disappears into before opponents can react. This defensive ability makes Horsea difficult to catch in the wild and allows it to flee from battles it's losing. The ink is described as squid-like rather than horse-like, mixing aquatic creature characteristics from multiple real-world animals into a single fantastical design. Seadra is more aggressive than Horsea, using its poisonous barbs to attack anything that approaches its territory. The Pokédex describes these barbs as sharp enough to pierce metal, allowing Seadra to damage even opponents with heavy armor or thick hides. This increased aggression marks the evolution from the relatively timid Horsea into a more dangerous predator. Goldeen is categorized as the goldfish Pokemon, despite looking more like a goldfish mixed with koi features. The horn on its head serves as both weapon and tool, allowing it to dig small caves in riverbeds where it lays eggs. This horn makes Goldeen distinctive among water types, giving it a physical feature that can function in battle beyond simple water-based attacks. Seeking is best known for its autumn spawning runs, where thousands of Seeking swim upstream to reproduce. These migration events turn rivers gold and red with the massive schools of Seeking, creating seasonal spectacles that humans travel to observe. The horn on Seeking's head grows larger and sharper during breeding season, used to compete with other males for mating rights. Staryu has a red gem core that glows at night, creating a distinctive pattern that helps Staryu recognize others of its species in dark waters. If the core is damaged, Staryu will regenerate it along with any lost limbs, making it nearly impossible to permanently injure. This regenerative ability makes Staryu incredibly durable, despite its relatively low defensive stats, as it can recover from injuries that would permanently disable most Pokemon. Starmie gains psychic powers when Staryu evolves, adding the psychic type to its water type base. The geometric transformation from Staryu's 5-pointed star shape to Starmie's 10-pointed form suggests a symmetry-based evolution, doubling the points and adding purple crystalline features that emphasize its psychic abilities. The core gem becomes more prominent and changes color, now glowing purple to match the psychic typing. Mr. Mime creates invisible barriers using psychic energy, miming the existence of walls that become real through sheer force of will. This reality warping ability makes Mr. Mime's pantomime performances dangerous, as observers might dismiss the gestures as performance art only to discover that the invisible objects are solid and impassable. The design creates one of Pokemon's stranger creatures, blending humanoid features with clearly non-human proportions and abilities. Scyther has blades for arms that it can't fold away or retract, leaving it permanently armed. These mantis-like scythes are sharp enough to slice through wood and even metal when swung with sufficient force. The speed at which Scyther moves makes these blades even more dangerous, allowing it to strike multiple times before opponents can react. The grass coloring provides camouflage in forests, letting Scyther ambush prey with blade strikes that appear from nowhere. Jynx has a controversial design that has been censored and altered in various regions due to perceived racial insensitivity. Originally depicted with black skin, later versions changed the skin to purple to avoid the problematic imagery. The controversy around Jynx demonstrates how character designs can carry unintended implications that become apparent only when viewed through different cultural contexts, leading to revisions that attempt to preserve the core design while removing offensive elements. Electabuzz generates electricity through friction created by its constant movement, building up static charges that it releases in battle. The Pokédex describes Electabuzz as attracted to power plants, where it feeds on electricity during blackouts, draining power from human infrastructure to sustain itself. This parasitic relationship with electrical systems positions Electabuzz as both a creature of nature and a pest that interferes with modern society. Magmar's body temperature exceeds 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, according to Pokédex measurements, hot enough to melt rock and metal. This extreme heat means Magmar leaves scorch marks wherever it walks and can cause combustible materials to ignite through proximity alone. The internal fire that produces this temperature requires constant fuel, forcing Magmar to consume large amounts of food to maintain its body heat. Pinsir has large horns that it uses to crush opponents in a vice-like grip, refusing to let go once it has secured a hold. The strength of these horns allows Pinsir to rip apart thick tree trunks and lift objects twice its own weight. In cold weather, Pinsir becomes sluggish as its body temperature drops, making it less effective in battle and forcing it to retreat to warmer areas to maintain combat effectiveness. Tauros has 3 tails that it whips against its own body to build rage before charging. Once sufficiently enraged, Tauros will charge anything it sees, unable to stop until it collides with something solid or exhausts itself completely. Multiple Tauros together will engage in stampedes that destroy everything in their path, creating herds that are dangerous to approach or try to control. There exists a Pokédex entry for Cantonian Tauros in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, despite the regional form being unobtainable at launch. This strange inclusion suggests either that plans existed to add Cantonian Tauros later through updates, or that the Pokédex entry was created in anticipation of future availability. The presence of a Pokédex entry with no corresponding Pokémon creates a peculiar gap in the game's collection completion. Magikarp is the only Pokémon in Scarlet and Violet unable to learn Terra Blast, lacking access to the move that nearly every other Pokémon can use. This restriction emphasizes Magikarp's status as the weakest Pokémon, unable even to perform the basic technique that defines the generation's battle mechanics. Even Ditto, which normally can't learn most moves, can transform and then use Terra Blast through the transformed Pokemon's move pool. Gyarados is tied with Pelipper as the most commonly used Pokemon among gym leaders across all games, with 7 different gym leaders using Gyarados on their teams. This frequent appearance reflects Gyarados' strong stats and intimidating design, making it a natural choice for gym leaders who want to present a significant challenge. The recurring presence of Gyarados across multiple regions suggests it's seen as an appropriately powerful Pokémon for testing trainers who have earned several badges. Lapras appears as the surfing Pokémon in certain photo opportunities in Pokémon X and Y. At Azure Bay, taking a picture while surfing will show the player riding on a Lapras, regardless of whether Lapras is in the party. This special interaction emphasizes Lapras' role as the gentle giant of water-type Pokémon, large enough to carry humans comfortably and calm enough to allow riders even among wild populations. Ditto and Manaphy are the only Pokémon capable of breeding that cannot be obtained through traditional eggs. Ditto is found in the wild or through trades, never hatching from eggs, despite being able to produce eggs with nearly any other Pokémon. Manaphy can breed to produce Phione, but Manaphy itself is only available through special events or specific in-game distributions, creating an unusual reproductive pattern where the offspring cannot produce the parent species. Eevee is the only non-water type Pokémon that can evolve using a water stone, gaining the water typing in the process to become Vaporeon. This unusual cross-type evolution reflects Eevee's unique nature as a Pokémon with unstable genetics that allow it to evolve into multiple forms representing different types. The various evolution stones trigger different genetic pathways, transforming Eevee into dramatically different Pokémon depending on which stone is used. Vaporeon has a glitch in Pokémon Yellow, where it learns both Haze and Mist at level 42. Since Generation 1 mechanics prevented Pokémon from learning 2 moves simultaneously through level up, Vaporeon would only learn Mist at level 42 during normal play. However, if Vaporeon reached level 42 while stored in the daycare, where moves are automatically learned, it would successfully learn both Haze and Mist, as the daycare system bypassed the normal limitation. Jolteon talks frequently about negative ions in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, explaining how it converts them into electricity. This scientific explanation provides a grounded basis for Jolteon's electric powers, suggesting a biological process that parallels real-world electrical generation. The negative ion absorption implies that Jolteon can generate electricity from atmospheric conditions, making it self-sufficient in power generation rather than requiring external charging. Flareon is the only evolution with type advantage against more than one other evolution, as both Leafeon and Glaceon are weak to fire-type attacks. This gives Flareon a unique strategic position among Eevee's evolutions, capable of threatening 2 of its counterparts in battle. The fire typing's offensive strength against grass and ice types makes Flareon versatile in ways the other evolutions aren't when facing each other. The Porygon evolutionary line is the only one that requires trading with different held items twice to reach its final form. Porygon evolves into Porygon 2 when traded holding an upgrade, then Porygon 2 evolves into Porygon Z when traded holding a dubious disc. This complex evolution path reflects the line's nature as artificial Pokémon created through human technology rather than natural biology, requiring specific digital upgrades to advance through their forms. Omanite can learn the move Tickle as an egg move, and the image of being tickled by an ancient, spiral-shelled creature with tentacles creates an unsettling mental picture. The move's addition to Omanite's possible move pool seems incongruous with the Pokémon's prehistoric, serious design, creating a moment of unexpected comedy in an otherwise straightforward rock and water-type fossil Pokémon. Omastar's Pokédex entries suggest it went extinct because its spiral shell grew too large and heavy for its body to support. This evolutionary dead-end explanation presents extinction as a failure of design, where a protective feature became so exaggerated that it destroyed the species it was meant to protect. The spiral shell's beauty and defensive capability became lethal through excessive development, turning an advantage into a fatal weakness. Kabuto's beta name was At, which may reference Atlantis given that Kabutops' beta name was Lantis. This naming connection suggests the fossil Pokémon line was originally more explicitly tied to the Lost City mythology, presenting them as remnants of an ancient underwater civilization rather than simply prehistoric creatures. The final names moved away from this direct reference, making the connection more subtle. Aerodactyl is unobtainable in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, but appears in Pokémon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, creating a situation where the Pokémon exists in a spin-off game, but not in the main series games of that generation. This unusual distribution reflects the different goals and limitations of the Pinball series, which could include Pokémon unavailable in the contemporary main games without creating consistency issues. Snorlax is programmed to have Charm as an egg move in Gold and Silver, but no Pokémon in Snorlax's egg group can learn Charm, making the egg move impossible to obtain through legitimate breeding. This programming oversight created a theoretical move that existed in the code but could never appear on an actual Snorlax without hacking, representing one of many small errors that accumulated in early Pokémon games due to the complexity of breeding mechanics. Articuno's Japanese name translates directly to Freezer, part of a trio of legendary birds whose Japanese names are simply Freezer, Thunder, and Fire. This straightforward naming reflects a less playful approach than the English names, which incorporated Latin and Spanish influences to create names that felt more mythological and less utilitarian than direct elemental labels. Zapdos is the legendary bird that can be encountered with the fewest gym badges in the original Red and Blue games, requiring only the Boulder badge and the Soul badge to reach its location in the power plant. This early availability required trading Pokémon with HM moves from another game or careful planning to have the right moves on accessible Pokémon, but it was technically possible to catch Zapdos well before obtaining the other legendary birds. A trainer on Cinnabar Island mentions that Blaine became a fire-type specialist after seeing a Moltres, providing rare insight into how gym leaders choose their specializations. This single line of dialogue suggests that encountering legendary Pokémon can be formative experiences that shape a trainer's entire career, giving Blaine's choice of fire types a mythological origin that elevates him beyond simply preferring a particular type. Dratini was originally designed because Game Freak wanted to add more cute Pokémon to Red and Green, which were initially dominated by fierce or strange-looking creatures. This deliberate choice to include adorable dragon-type Pokémon reflects an understanding that variety in tone and appearance was necessary to appeal to broader audiences, preventing the games from feeling too aggressive or intimidating. Dragonair is also the name of a former airline based in Hong Kong, creating an unusual situation where a Pokémon shares a name with a real-world company. This coincidence has led to occasional confusion and references that connect the graceful dragon Pokémon with air travel, though the name similarity appears to be accidental rather than intentional reference. Dragonite's catch rate was changed from 45 to 9 in Pokémon Yellow, making it significantly harder to catch despite players having no opportunity to encounter wild Dragonite in that game. This change affected only the internal data, serving no practical purpose since Dragonite couldn't be found in Yellow except through evolution, making the catch rate adjustment purely theoretical. Mewtwo was the very first Pokémon shown in the English anime, appearing at the start of the opening sequence before the show's plot begins. This prominent placement established Mewtwo as the ultimate Pokémon, the goal that the series was building toward, even though most of the show's narrative focuses on more common Pokémon. The opening sequence's choice to feature Mewtwo rather than Mew or any starter Pokémon emphasized power over cuteness in introducing Western audiences to the franchise. Mew was created just 2 weeks before Pokémon Red and Green finished development and released in Japan. The Pokémon was added by programmer Shigeki Morimoto, who found empty space in the game's code and inserted Mew without telling anyone, intending it as a hidden surprise. This secret edition was only revealed after the games had already launched, when rumors about Mew began circulating and Nintendo acknowledged its existence, leading to official distribution events and eventually the Mew glitch discovery. And so, the 151 creatures of Kanto reveal themselves through these small details, one fact at a time. Each Pokémon carries more than what appears on screen, more than stats and types and battle animations. They carry design decisions, programming quirks, lore that spans decades, and small choices that accumulated into something larger than any single element. The region feels more complete when you understand not just what each Pokémon does, but what makes it distinct, what small detail separates it from the others, what thought went into its existence beyond simply filling a slot in the Pokédex. These facts don't change how the games play, but they change how they feel. Knowing that Mewtwo appeared first in the anime, that Mew was a last-minute addition hidden in spare code, that Snorlax has an egg move it can never learn naturally. All of this adds texture to a world that already felt rich with possibility. The Pokémon become more than tools for battle or collection goals. They become artifacts of a creative process that spanned years, shaped by hundreds of decisions, both large and small, refined through iteration and accident and inspiration. The journey through all 151 ends not with revelation, but with deeper appreciation for how much thought exists in details most players never notice. Each name has a reason, each Pokédex entry a purpose, each design choice a history. The Kanto region was built with care that extended far beyond what was necessary for functional gameplay, creating a world that rewards attention to detail with endless small discoveries. If you stayed through all 151, you've seen more than a list of facts. You've seen how a world builds itself, one creature at a time, how each small addition strengthens the whole, how the sum of details creates something greater than any individual element could achieve alone. Perhaps now, when you encounter these Pokémon in games or media, you'll see them differently. Perhaps you'll remember the small story each one carries. Perhaps that knowledge will settle into your understanding of Kanto, making the region feel more lived in, more thoughtfully constructed, more real. The night has carried you through all 151 Pokémon of Kanto, and yet there remains more to understand about how these creatures fit together, how their individual details form patterns that speak to broader design philosophies and development realities. Consider how many of these facts relate to simple programming constraints or oversights. Snorlax's impossible egg move, Vaporeon's dual learning glitch in yellow, Ivysaur's name triggering censorship filters. All of these represent moments where the complexity of game development created unintended outcomes. The games were built by humans working under time pressure, making thousands of decisions, and inevitably some of those decisions conflicted with others, or created situations that only became apparent after release. These programming quirks humanize the development process, revealing that even carefully planned games contain errors and oddities. The developers couldn't anticipate every interaction between systems, couldn't predict how strict nickname filters would flag official Pokémon names, couldn't foresee that creating an egg move for Snorlax without ensuring any compatible Pokémon could pass it on would result in an unreachable move. These small failures don't diminish the games, but rather emphasize the ambitious scale of what was attempted, creating interconnected systems so complex that complete perfection was never achievable. The Pokédex entries themselves reveal interesting patterns in how creatures were characterized. Many entries emphasize danger, describing Pokémon as capable of killing, destroying environments, or causing widespread harm. Muck's toxic trail that prevents plant growth for 3 years, Hypno kidnapping a child, Parasect being controlled by a parasitic fungus while the original host dies. These dark elements coexist with the game's generally lighthearted tone, creating a world that is simultaneously friendly and genuinely dangerous. This tonal complexity distinguishes Pokémon from purely innocent children's media. The games acknowledge mortality, predation, and the genuine risks of living in a world filled with powerful creatures. Trainers get injured in the anime, Pokémon are described as dying in Pokédex entries, and the existence of Pokémon centers treating injured creatures implies that battles cause real harm, despite the game's mechanics preventing permanent death. This willingness to gesture toward darker realities, while maintaining an optimistic surface tone, creates depth that allows Pokémon to appeal to older audiences without alienating younger players. The evolutionary mechanics revealed through these facts also show interesting inconsistencies. Some evolutions involve physical maturation, growing larger and more powerful while maintaining the same basic form. Others involve radical transformations, completely changing body structure and capabilities. Kakuna's potential arms represent transformation in progress, the cocoon stage containing a creature actively restructuring itself into something entirely different. Slowpoke evolving through Shelder symbiosis introduces evolution as collaboration or parasitism rather than individual growth. Magnemite combining into Magneton presents evolution as fusion, multiple entities becoming one more powerful unit. These varied evolutionary paths suggest that evolution in Pokémon encompasses multiple biological processes rather than being a single phenomenon. The term might be convenient shorthand for growth, metamorphosis, symbiosis, and fusion, all occurring within the same classification system. This flexibility allows Pokémon to draw from diverse, real-world biological concepts without being constrained by scientific accuracy, creating evolutionary paths that feel logical within the game world's internal rules while disregarding actual evolutionary theory. The legendary Pokémon facts reveal careful planning around how players encounter these special creatures. Zapdos being obtainable with fewer badges than the other legendary birds suggests intentional choice rather than accident, providing players who explore thoroughly with access to legendary power earlier than expected. Mewtwo's prominent placement in the anime's opening sequence positions it as the ultimate goal from the series' first moments. Mew's secret edition, just before release, turned it into a genuine mystery, a creature that existed in the code but had no official means of capture, sparking rumors and playground myths that contributed significantly to Pokémon's initial popularity surge. These legendary creatures serve narrative purposes beyond their battle capabilities. They represent goals that extend beyond the gym challenge, secrets to uncover, proof that the world contains more than what's immediately visible. The difficulty of obtaining Mew without events or glitches creates genuine rarity, making it more special than Pokémon like Dragonite that are theoretically harder to catch but ultimately accessible through normal play. Legendary Pokémon justify continued exploration after the main story ends, providing reasons to return to previous areas and search thoroughly for hidden encounters. The cross-generational changes, like Magnemite gaining Steel typing retroactively, or Butterfree finally learning Bug-type moves in Generation 3, show how the developers refined their understanding of type relationships and move distributions over time. Early games established patterns that later seemed inadequate or inconsistent, requiring adjustments that changed how older Pokémon functioned. These retroactive changes acknowledged that the initial type chart and move distributions weren't perfect, that improvements could be made, and that preserving consistency with previous games mattered less than creating better balance and logical coherence. This willingness to revise demonstrates respect for the game's ongoing life beyond individual releases. Rather than treating each generation as separate and allowing inconsistencies to persist because they existed in older games, the developers chose to update and improve, accepting that changes would affect how previous generation Pokémon worked when transferred forward, but prioritizing overall quality over strict compatibility. This approach keeps the series feeling cohesive across generations, rather than fragmenting into disconnected eras with incompatible rules. Though anime-specific facts, like Ash's Caterpie being the first caught Pokemon, or Jigglypuff's recurring role drawing on sleeping viewers' faces, reveal how the show developed its own mythology separate from the games. While the games presented Pokemon as tools for battle and in collection, the anime emphasized personality, relationships, and individual character arcs. Ash's Pikachu's never evolving became a statement about accepting creatures as they are rather than pushing them toward power, contradicting the game's implicit message that evolution represents improvement and should be pursued. These divergent narratives between game and anime created a franchise where different media could emphasize different themes while maintaining the same core setting and creatures. Players who only experienced the games might view Pokemon primarily as battling tools, while viewers who only watched the anime might see them as companions and friends with complex emotional lives. This flexibility in interpretation allowed Pokemon to mean different things to different audiences, broadening its appeal beyond what a single consistent narrative could achieve. The naming patterns visible across these facts show various approaches to creating memorable pronounceable names. Simple reversals like Ekans and Arbok provided immediate clarity about what the Pokemon represented. Japanese names translated literally, like Articuno becoming Freezer, showed more utilitarian naming conventions that English translations made more poetic and mythological. Names referencing pop culture figures, like Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, created clear connections that might be lost on players unfamiliar with the references, but provided additional meaning for those who recognized them. These naming strategies reflect Pokemon's need to appeal globally while originating in Japan. Names needed to be easy to pronounce across languages, memorable enough to stick in players' minds, and descriptive enough to provide hints about the Pokemon's nature or abilities. Achieving all three goals simultaneously required creativity and compromise, leading to names that succeeded to varying degrees depending on the criteria emphasized. The fossil Pokemon facts, particularly the beta names suggesting Atlantis connections, reveal how concepts get simplified during development. Early ideas often contain more ambitious narrative implications that get pared back to maintain focus. The fossil Pokemon, as remnants of Atlantis, would have positioned them as pieces of a lost civilization rather than simply extinct species, adding lore that might have proven distracting or difficult to integrate with Kanto's generally straightforward world building. The decision to make their connection to ancient history less specific allowed them to function as simple prehistoric creatures without requiring extensive backstory. This pattern of simplification appears throughout game development, where initial concepts contain more complexity than the final product needs or can support. Features get cut, lore gets condensed, and connections between elements become less explicit to avoid overwhelming players with information. The traces of these earlier, more complex versions remain visible in beta content and unused data, showing what might have been before practical concerns led to streamlining. The distribution quirks, like Aerodactyl appearing in Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, but not in the main games of that generation, demonstrate how spin-off titles operate with different priorities and constraints than main series entries. Pinball games can include any Pokemon that fits their gameplay needs without worrying about maintaining internal consistency with contemporary main games, as pinball exists as a separate experience with different goals. This freedom allows spin-offs to explore possibilities that main games can't accommodate, providing alternative ways to interact with Pokémon that don't need to align with the core series mechanics or distributions. The competitive facts, like Gyarados appearing on 7 gym leader teams, reveal which Pokémon the developers considered appropriate challenges for players at various skill levels. Gyarados' combination of intimidating appearance and strong stats makes it suitable for gym leaders who need to present genuine difficulty without being impossible to defeat. Its water and flying typing creates interesting strategic considerations while remaining vulnerable to common counter strategies, making it challenging but fair. The repeated use of Gyarados across multiple gym leaders suggests it hit the sweet spot of difficulty, memorability, and versatility that made it perfect for multiple contexts. These design choices around NPC teams show careful consideration of player experience, ensuring that gym battles felt appropriately challenging while remaining winnable with various team compositions. Gym leaders needed signature Pokémon that emphasized their specialization while avoiding teams so optimized that only specific strategies could win. This balance required understanding not just individual Pokémon strength, but how different team compositions would perform against the typical teams players assembled at various points in their journey. The Pokédex category inconsistencies, like Blastoise being the shellfish Pokémon when Giant Turtle would make more sense, suggest either playful misdirection or early categorization decisions that persisted despite seeming odd. The shared shellfish category with Kabuto and Kabutops implies an intentional connection that's never explicitly explained, leaving players to speculate about possible relationships between these disparate creatures. This ambiguity creates space for fan theories and interpretation, turning a potentially simple categorization error into a source of ongoing discussion and speculation. Such deliberate ambiguities appear throughout Pokémon, with the games providing enough information to spark curiosity, but not enough to answer every question definitively. Diglett's hidden body, Tangela's concealed form, Kubona's mother's skull creating biological impossibilities, all of these mysteries persist because official sources refuse to provide definitive answers. This restraint in lore building prevents the franchise from becoming over-explained, maintaining a sense of discovery and wonder that would be lost if every detail received official clarification. The move-learning inconsistencies, like Pidgeotto being unable to learn Peck, despite Pokédex entries describing its pecking attacks, show how game mechanics and lore don't always align perfectly. The developers prioritized balance and gameplay considerations over ensuring every Pokémon could learn moves its Pokédex entries mention, accepting that some disconnects between description and capability were inevitable. These inconsistencies rarely impact gameplay significantly, but create cognitive dissonance for players who read carefully and notice the contradictions. Such disconnects emphasize that Pokémon games function primarily as mechanical systems rather than simulation attempts. The Pokédex entries provide flavor and character, establishing the world's tone and giving each Pokémon personality beyond its stats. The moves and abilities represent gameplay balance, ensuring each Pokémon fills a specific combat role without becoming overpowered or completely useless. These two systems operate semi-independently, influencing each other, but not being strictly bound by consistency requirements that would limit design flexibility. The statistical quirks, like Pidgey having the shortest cry or Cloyster having the highest defense, reveal how the developers use numbers to create distinctiveness. In a roster of over 100 Pokémon, ensuring each one felt unique required both visual and mechanical differentiation. Giving certain Pokémon extreme values and specific stats created niches that made them useful in particular situations, even if their overall power level wasn't exceptional. Cloyster's incredible defense made it the best physical wall in Generation 1 despite modest stats elsewhere, creating a specific role that only it could fill optimally. These stat distributions also created informal tier systems where certain Pokémon became known as the best choice for specific strategies. Chansey's massive hit points made it the premier special wall. Alakazam's exceptional special attack and speed made it the strongest special sweeper. Tauros's well-rounded offensive stats and solid speed made it the most reliable physical attacker. These unofficial designations emerged from player testing and competitive play, identifying which Pokémon excelled in ways that mattered for high-level battles. The breeding mechanics revealed through these facts show increasing complexity as the series progressed. Generation 1 had no breeding at all, with all Pokémon caught from wild populations. Generation 2 introduced breeding as a way to obtain baby Pokémon and pass down moves, creating strategic depth around egg moves and inheritance. The discovery that Snorlax had an egg move no compatible Pokémon could teach revealed how complex the breeding system had become, with move compatibilities creating chains of possibility that sometimes resulted in dead ends where planned combinations proved impossible to achieve legitimately. This breeding complexity transformed Pokémon from simple creatures to customized through training into genetic projects where careful breeding could produce offspring with optimal stats and move combinations impossible to find in wild populations. The strategic layer this added appealed to dedicated players while remaining ignorable for those who simply wanted to progress through the story, creating depth that enhanced rather than complicated the core experience. The regional variation mentions, like Alolan Exeggutor gaining dragon typing and extreme height, show how later generations used regional forms to reimagine original Pokémon in new contexts. These variations allowed the developers to revisit early designs with decades of experience, creating alternative versions that could be more ambitious or experimental than updates to the original forms would allow. Regional variants let Exeggutor become the absurdly tall dragon it perhaps should have been originally, without invalidating the standard version that players knew and expected. This approach to updating classic Pokémon through regional variants rather than replacing original versions demonstrates respect for player nostalgia and attachment. Rather than declaring that Exeggutor was always meant to be dragon type and retroactively changing it, the games presented Alolan Exeggutor as an alternative that coexisted with the original. Players could prefer either version without being told their choice was wrong, preserving affection for original forms while introducing new possibilities. The cross-media appearances, like Meowth's Team Rocket role in the anime, or the Nidorino vs. Jengar battle in the opening sequence, show how Pokémon visibility across different media wasn't purely based on strength or popularity, but on narrative utility and visual appeal. Meowth became prominent not because it was a powerful Pokémon, but because its humanoid features made it easy to animate expressively, and its ability to speak created comedy opportunities. Nidorino appeared prominently because its battle with Gengar created a visually striking opening that introduced the concept of Pokémon battles dramatically. These media appearances influenced which Pokémon became iconic beyond their game roles. Charizard gained prominence partly through being Ash's eventual powerhouse in the anime. Psyduck became memorable through Misty's constant frustration with its confusion. Jigglypuff became a recurring joke character. These anime roles created identities that sometimes overshadowed the Pokémon's game capabilities, making them recognizable to broader audiences who might never play the games but watch the show. The type advantage facts, like Flareon being uniquely strong against multiple other evolutions, reveal competitive dynamics within Pokémon families. The evolutions provide a microcosm of type relationships, with each one strong against some relatives and weak to others, creating a balanced system where no single evolution dominates. Flareon's advantage over both Leafeon and Glaceon might seem to make it superior, but Vaporeon beats Flareon, while Leafeon beats Vaporeon, creating a complex relationship web where each evolution has roles it excels in without being universally optimal. These internal family balances demonstrate careful attention to relative power levels, ensuring that players choosing different evolutionary paths for their EV weren't making objectively wrong decisions. Each evolution provided different capabilities and faced different challenges, making the choice meaningful without creating trap options that would frustrate players who chose poorly. The glitch-related facts, like the Mew glitch discovered years after Red and Blue's release, show how communities continue discovering new information about games long after developers move on to new projects. The Mew glitch exploited specific programming quirks to force the game to generate an encounter with Mew, something never intended to be possible through normal gameplay. The discovery that this glitch existed required a deep understanding of the game's code and careful experimentation representing player expertise that exceeded what the developers expected or planned for. These community discoveries extend games' lifespans beyond their official content, creating unofficial achievements and challenges that players set for themselves. Speedrunning, challenge runs, glitch exhibitions, all of these player-created activities add value to games that developers couldn't anticipate during development. The fact that players cared enough about accessing Mew to reverse engineer the game's code and discover exploitation methods demonstrates investment in the world that goes far beyond casual play. The merchandise mentions, like Charmander appearing on Nightway currency or specific Pokémon becoming cultural symbols, show how successful game characters can transcend their medium to become recognized cultural icons. Pikachu's mascot status led to it appearing on countless products unrelated to gaming, becoming a symbol that people recognized even if they'd never played Pokémon. This transition from game character to cultural icon represents success at a level few gaming franchises achieve, where the characters become meaningful beyond their original context. Such cultural penetration creates feedback loops where Pokémon's visibility in non-gaming spaces increases interest in the games, bringing in new players who first encountered the characters elsewhere. A child who receives Pikachu merchandise might become curious about the games those characters come from, converting casual familiarity into active engagement. This merchandise-driven awareness building extends the franchise's reach far beyond what game sales alone could achieve. The development timeline facts, like Raiden being the first Pokémon designed or Mew being added 2 weeks before release, provide rare glimpses into the creative process behind the games. Knowing that Raiden preceded all other Pokémon conceptually makes it feel historically significant, despite not having prominent role in games or media. This first design established patterns that would influence hundreds of subsequent creatures, making it foundational even though players encountering it in-game have no way to know its precedence. These development stories humanize the creation process, revealing that these now iconic characters had to start somewhere, that someone made the first sketch that would eventually lead to a global phenomenon. The fact that Mew was added almost as an afterthought, hidden in spare code by a programmer working independently, shows how crucial decisions sometimes happen through individual initiative rather than committee planning. Mew's secret existence became one of Pokémon's most compelling mysteries, driving early interest through playground rumors and magazine speculation, all because one developer saw empty space in the code and decided to fill it with something special. The anatomical mysteries, like Diglett's hidden body or what's beneath Tangela's vines, create ongoing sources of speculation that keep players engaged with the universe. These deliberately unanswered questions invite imagination, letting players construct their own theories about what these hidden features might be. Official materials occasionally hint at answers, providing glimpses that suggest possibilities without confirming any single interpretation, maintaining the mystery while acknowledging that players care about these details. Such sustained ambiguity requires restraint, resisting the temptation to provide definitive answers that would end speculation. The developers understand that sometimes the mystery itself is more valuable than any answer could be, that imagination fills unknown spaces with possibilities more interesting than concrete reality might provide. Diglett could have a complex body structure, or it could just be a head with tiny feet, and both possibilities remain valid because no official source commits to either explanation. The cry-length fact about Pidgey demonstrates attention to small details that most players wouldn't consciously notice, but that contribute to overall feel. A cry lasting less than a fifth of a second registers more as a chirp than a vocalization, creating an almost subliminal bird presence rather than an attention-grabbing sound. This subtlety makes Pidgey feel like a background element of Kanto's environment, present but not intrusive, exactly what an extremely common bird Pokémon should be. These micro-level design choices accumulate into macro-level atmosphere. The length of cries, the color palettes used for environments, the music tempo during different situations, all of these small decisions work together to create emotional responses that players might not attribute to specific causes. Pidgey's brief cry contributes to Kanto feeling lived in and natural rather than artificial, even though players likely never consciously think about how long each Pokemon's vocalization lasts. The competitive usage stats, like Gyarados being tied for most common gym leader Pokemon, reveal development patterns in how challenging teams are constructed. Certain Pokemon appear repeatedly because they occupy useful middle ground difficulty, strong enough to challenge players without being impossible to defeat. Gym leaders need teams that test player skill and strategy without creating insurmountable walls that block progress, requiring Pokemon that are threatening but beatable, memorable but not so distinctive that using them repeatedly feels repetitive. This balance is harder to achieve than it might seem, as Pokemon that are too weak make gym battles trivial, while Pokemon that are too strong create frustration and difficulty spikes. The repeated use of certain Pokemon like Gyarados suggests the developers identified a group of creatures that consistently provided appropriate challenge levels across different points in various games, making them reliable choices for gym leader teams even at the cost of reduced variety. The evolutionary restriction facts, like Nidorina and Nidoqueen being unable to breed, create strategic considerations that affect gameplay beyond simple collection. Players need to maintain Nidoran females if they want to breed the line, unable to rely on keeping only the final evolution. This restriction forces engagement with the evolutionary line's full progression rather than allowing players to immediately jump to the strongest form and ignore earlier stages. The biological peculiarity becomes a gameplay mechanic that encourages appreciation of all evolutionary stages. Such restrictions also create interesting lore implications. Why would evolving make a Pokemon unable to breed when evolution generally represents reaching maturity? The games never explain this contradiction, leaving it as a mechanical quirk that players must work around. Possible explanations range from the hormonal changes from evolution affecting fertility to some mystical property of the evolutionary process itself, but the lack of official explanation means players can construct whatever headcanon makes sense to them. The type change, mentions like Clefairy and Clefubble becoming Fairy type in Generation 6, show how retroactive type assignments reshaped the competitive landscape. Pokemon that had been normal type for years suddenly gained new strengths and weaknesses, changing how they functioned in battle without altering their appearance or base stats. These type adjustments acknowledge that the Fairy type should have existed from the beginning, that certain Pokemon never quite fit their original typing, and that improving the type system justified retroactive changes to existing Pokemon. This willingness to substantially change how classic Pokemon function demonstrates commitment to ongoing balance and improvement rather than treating early games as untouchable. The developers could have introduced Fairy type only for new Pokemon, avoiding the complexity of retroactive assignments, but choosing to redesignate existing Pokemon showed that improving the overall system mattered more than preserving exact consistency with how those Pokemon worked in previous generations. The trainer behavior facts, like Blaine choosing fire types after seeing Moltres, provide rare character building within games that generally treat NPCs as static obstacles rather than developed personalities. This single line of dialogue makes Blaine feel like a person with history and motivation rather than simply a fire-type specialist positioned to challenge players. The connection to Moltres creates implicit narrative about inspiration and dedication, suggesting that encountering legendary Pokemon can be life-changing experiences that define entire careers. Such small character touches appear rarely in Pokemon games, which generally prioritize gameplay over storytelling. When they do appear, they create disproportionate impact, making characters feel more real and the world feel more lived in. A single line explaining why Blaine chose his specialization does more to make him memorable than any amount of dialogue about his gym or his battle strategy could achieve. The artistic challenge facts, like Venusaur being difficult for Ken Sugimori to draw, reveal that even experienced artists find certain designs challenging. The complexity of Venusaur's flower, with its overlapping petals and integration into the creature's body, creates technical difficulties that simpler Pokemon avoid. This admission that official artists struggle with certain designs humanizes the creation process, showing that producing consistent, quality artwork for hundreds of different creatures requires dealing with varying difficulty levels, where some designs cooperate and others fight against clean execution. These artistic considerations affect which Pokemon get featured prominently in promotional materials. Simpler designs that are easier to draw and animate appear more frequently, while complex designs like Venusaur might be used more sparingly to avoid requiring excessive artist time. This creates an indirect feedback loop where design complexity affects visibility, which affects popularity, which affects future design decisions as developers learn which aesthetic approaches succeed commercially. And so the web of facts connecting Kanto's 151 Pokemon reveals itself as something larger than simple trivia. Each fact connects to others, creating patterns that illuminate how the games were made, how the franchise evolved, and how communities engaged with these creatures over decades. The programming quirks reflect development realities. The Pokédex inconsistencies show prioritization of tone over logic. The competitive patterns reveal careful balance consideration. The cross-media appearances demonstrate how characters gain meaning beyond their original context. Understanding these connections transforms the experience of playing Pokemon games. What might seem like arbitrary choices or random details instead become deliberate decisions made within constraints, compromises between competing priorities, solutions to problems that players might not realize existed. The games feel richer when you recognize the thought and effort behind each element, when you see the accumulated decisions that shaped every aspect of the experience. The facts also reveal how franchises evolve over time, how early decisions create expectations and limitations that later games must work within or actively break. The developers could have abandoned breeding mechanics entirely in newer generations, but player expectations had been set, and removing features would have felt like regression rather than progress. Similarly, the stat distributions and type relationships established in early games create frameworks that constrain future designs, as new Pokémon must fit within the existing system rather than forcing complete redesigns of core mechanics. This evolutionary path shows how successful games become increasingly difficult to change dramatically, as accumulated design choices create weight that limits flexibility. The Kanto Pokémon established patterns that would influence hundreds of future creatures, making their design particularly important, even though the developers couldn't have known how long the series would continue or how many games would build on these foundations. The cultural impact facts demonstrate how gaming franchises can escape their medium to become broader cultural phenomena. Pokémon transcended being a game series to become a cultural force that influenced fashion, language, television, and even economics. This success required not just good games, but characters and concepts that resonated broadly enough to attract audiences beyond gaming enthusiasts, creating a franchise that could sustain itself through multiple revenue streams and media formats simultaneously. Such broad success is rare and difficult to replicate deliberately. The developers made choices that happened to align with broader cultural currents, creating characters that filled needs they might not have consciously identified. Pikachu became a mascot partly through deliberate choice, but partly through audience response that the developers recognized and amplified. The franchise's trajectory involved both planning and adaptation, recognizing what worked and emphasizing those elements, while de-emphasizing aspects that didn't resonate as strongly. The mystery facts, like Cubone wearing its mother's skull or Parasect being controlled by fungus, show willingness to include dark elements within an overall optimistic framework. These disturbing details coexist with friendship themes and adventure narratives, creating tonal complexity that makes the world feel more realistic despite being fantasy. Real ecosystems include parasitism and death alongside beauty and cooperation, and Pokémon's inclusion of darker elements acknowledges this reality without dwelling on it or letting it overwhelm the generally positive atmosphere. This tonal balance allows Pokémon to age with its audience, providing surface-level appeal for younger players while including details that older players can appreciate for their darker implications. A child might not fully process the horror of Parasect being a corpse controlled by fungus, but an adult recognizes the body horror and appreciates the boldness of including such concepts in a children's game. This multi-layered design creates broader appeal than work aimed purely at a single demographic could achieve. The move-learning complexity, like Butterfree not learning Bug, moves until Generation 3, shows how game balance evolves as developers identify problems and develop solutions. Early games had issues that became apparent only through player experience and competitive analysis. Butterfree being unable to use bug moves, despite being a bug type, represented a design oversight that took years to correct, finally being addressed when the developers had both the time and the move pool to provide appropriate options. These corrections demonstrate that the developers pay attention to community feedback and long-standing issues, even if fixes take years to implement. The fact that Butterfree eventually got bug moves shows commitment to improving the experience, even for Pokémon from the earliest games, ensuring that every creature remained viable and coherent, rather than letting mistakes persist because they existed in original versions. The linguistic facts, like Arbok being Cobra reversed, or Japanese legendary bird names being simply Freezer, Thunder, and Fire, reveal different cultural approaches to naming. English names often incorporate wordplay and multiple language references, creating names that work on several levels. Japanese names tend toward more direct description, prioritizing clarity and immediate comprehension over clever wordplay. These different philosophies reflect broader cultural differences in how language is used and valued, with neither approach being superior, but each creating different types of player experiences. The localization process involves navigating these differences, finding English names that preserve the spirit of Japanese originals while working within English linguistic constraints and cultural contexts. Sometimes this means keeping concepts similar while changing specific references. Other times, it means completely reimagining names to achieve similar effects through different methods. The success of Pokemon's localization contributed significantly to its global spread, as Western audiences received names and concepts that felt native rather than awkwardly translated. These naming decisions affect how players relate to Pokemon, as names create first impressions and shape expectations. A well-chosen name helps players immediately understand what a Pokemon represents and remember it more easily, while awkward names create distance and confusion. The care put into naming demonstrates recognition that these seemingly small decisions significantly impact player experience and franchise success. The night deepens as we approach the end of this journey through Kanto's 151 Pokemon. Each fact has revealed something about how games are made, how franchises evolve, and how communities engage with media they care about. The accumulation of details creates a picture far more complex than any single fact could provide, showing the depth hidden within what might seem like simple children's games. Understanding this depth doesn't diminish the game's accessibility or charm, but rather enhances appreciation for the craft involved in their creation. The developers made thousands of decisions, most of which players never consciously notice, but which accumulate into experiences that feel coherent and engaging. The bugs and oversights that appear in these facts don't represent failures, but rather evidence of ambitious attempts to create complex systems under real-world constraints. The Kanto region, built from these 151 creatures and their accumulated details, becomes more than just a video game setting. It transforms into a place with history, personality, and depth that rewards attention and exploration. Each Pokemon contributes to this sense of place, adding details that make the region feel complete and lived in rather than artificial. Perhaps now, having spent this time examining each creature's small story, you understand Kanto differently. Perhaps the Pokemon you've encountered countless times in games feel more substantial, carrying hidden weight and meaning beyond their surface appearances. Perhaps the care and thought invested in their creation becomes visible in ways it wasn't before. The 151 Pokemon of Kanto each carry their fact, their small piece of the larger story. Together, they form something greater than the sum of their parts, a region and a franchise that has endured for decades and will likely continue far into the future, shaped by these foundational creatures that established what Pokemon could be. The facts fade now into memory, settling into your understanding of this world you've explored. The night carries you toward rest, toward dreams that might contain these creatures you've come to know more deeply. Perhaps they'll visit you there, in that space between waking and sleep, each one bringing its small detail, its quiet story, its place in the larger tapestry of Kanto. And as the 151 creatures find their rest in your memory, you too can find rest, carrying these details into sleep like small lights that slowly fade but never quite disappear entirely.